and the Greeks really establishing themselves in Kemet and having, so many years in there to pull out the information. They are the ones that we really have to pay attention to the most. Now, it's crazy because there's no way you can be an historian or a researcher and go back in that time and look at the fact that before Kemet fell, you don't see the Greeks, really dressing like the Egyptians and all that stuff that we seen that I showed you guys from the museum. You don't see all that stuff until after the conquest. So it's as if, they was watching and waiting, really being jealous and really waiting to go in there and to be like the Egyptians and have that knowledge. And it seems like, once they took it, they really embellished themselves within that information and really got a lot out of it. But history wise, when you go into the Bible, again, there's no way you can have these stories about these ancient times and not mention Alexander. You will not see Alexander mentioned in the King James Version, which is the authorized version. This is the version that they gave us. This is important to understand about the King James Version, how you can't just be, crazy with it and just overlook it. You have to really accept this version and why it was given to us, because there's a lot behind it. So when you realize that it does not speak of Alexander in the King James Version, it speaks of Darius, but we don't see nothing about the Ptolemies or Alexander in the King James Version. And as I mentioned before, you have to really know about the Ptolemies if you're talking about biblical history, because they play a huge role. So, as I said, they took out the Apocrypha, or what they call the Deuterocanonical books, the Apocrypha, which is, about 15 books that basically was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament in the King James Version until about, the 1880s when they took it out. Just all of a sudden took out all of these books, and they said that they wasn't really, as close to the other books, meaning they wasn't as divinely inspired as the other books of the Bible. So they removed them. Now, what makes that suspect and why this is important is because you have Maccabees, which we're going to get into first, Maccabees, which is where it's talking about Alexander. It's talking about the Ptolemies. It's talking about that time. Now, when you read Daniel, as I was talking about before, it's also talking about the Ptolemies and Alexander, but it does not mention their names, which is really suspect. It's, what's going on. So you can see how, as I showed you in part 1, we found the history. We went back and looked at the fact that the Bible's history, talking about what was going on with the Phoenicians in Tyre, what was going on in those lands during that time, and what really happened when Alexander came in there and destroyed that city. We see the actual proven history differs from what it's talking about in biblical history. They don't even mention Alexander, but we know that whole story has to do with him, but it's not in your Bible. But we can see that they clearly is talking about the same thing. And I showed you in part 1 how they mixed it up, how when we go back and find that the hidden meaning is actually telling you who would come into those lands and conquer it. So you see how they switch it up. It's the same thing. So what a lot of religious people do is they go in, they read the Bible, and the ones who do know history understand about the Ptolemies. So a lot of people pick up on the stories and say, you know what, they're talking about the Ptolemies, even though they don't mention them by name. The issue with that is if you don't go and look at actual history, a lot of people are believing that the story the Bible is putting out is actually real history, when that's not the case. The case is, if you do not look at actual history and what many historians have, agreed upon, then compare it to the Bible, you won't get the truth. So when people see that, the simple fact that, the story exists and that in real history, you have a story. Difference is when you compare the stories, they are different. One is made to fit the biblical version, and one is the actual history. So you have to believe the actual history over the biblical version that is put there to steal to implant itself into history to give validity to the Bible. But when you understand, it's how can you not put them in there? But in our Apocrypha, in First Maccabees, says clear as day. It's talking about Alexander. So it says here, this history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers, and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen, who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. So this is how we understand how Ptolemy I Soter became king of Egypt, who Ptolemy I Soter was one of his generals. And you start to really understand what was going on around that time. So the reason why, we mention Game of Thrones in this part is because when we go through this, you're going to understand where they got the whole entire concept from. I mean, when you start reading about this time and this history and what was going on between these generals, between these people who split up these kingdoms and had different lands, you see Game of Thrones. I mean, everything that you see, if you watch Game of Thrones, you're really going to understand this. Everything that you see and what's taking place in Game of Thrones is here. The only thing that is missing is dragons, but not really. Not really. Because when you start to understand that in Daniel, it's talking about dragons, as I pointed out, but also in the Apocrypha, one, we have Maccabees where it's talking about Alexander getting into the Ptolemies, but also part of the Apocrypha, you have the whole story about Bel and the dragons. And in Bel and the Dragons is talking about Daniel, which how fitting is talking about Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it's talking about the Ptolemies. So you do have dragons. And as you get into the story, you're going to have female warriors and you're going to have, the same terminology about king of the north, king of the south, the kingdoms, bending the knee. All of this terminology you hear, you read about when it's talking about ancient Greece and the Ptolemies and everything that happened in the wars of the Diadochi and what took place. It's nowhere around that. Game of Thrones is talking about the Ptolemaic Empire, the Diadochi War, and what was going on back then. Plain and simple. It's nowhere around that to me. The whole thing about Ptolemy being a bastard, same thing with Game of Thrones, all that kind of talk is in the stories when you start reading and getting into it. And as we get into it, you're going to see what I'm talking about, and you can start to point out things. If you're into Game of Thrones, you'll understand exactly what it's saying. So now understand, we're going to get into the story. Now, when Alexander died, of course, the best thing to do, even though he split up the whole territory, he started splitting up the kingdoms. And the best thing to do is to try to really take his spot. Everybody knew that when Alexander died, the person who took his spot would be looked at as the true ruler. So even if it was, something that came up with the kingdoms, that they would go to this ruler as being the final decision, the one who has the most power. Because you can't just split up kingdoms and then, have these kingdoms supposed to be full of just Greek people and equal. Somebody still has to rule. Somebody has to be the authority, even though they had kingdoms. So of course you're the ruler in your kingdom, but really the person who would replace Alexander would be looked at as the true king. So, a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra, his sister, when he died. And one of the things you'll understand, do not get caught up in the names. There are many Cleopatras. A lot of people they got this idea that it's one Cleopatra. It's many Cleopatras. There are many Alexanders. there are many Ptolemies. When you start getting into the stories, you'll understand that these names get passed down, which is why you have Ptolemy the first, second, what have you, Alexander the first, second, fourth, or what have you. Same thing with Cleopatra. So don't get caught up in the names. There's more than one Cleopatra. So a lot of people tried to marry Cleopatra to, get that marriage going so they can kind of sort of be the one who was looked at as the main king on the throne. Now, it was rumored that Cleopatra was going to marry Perdiccas, who was one of Alexander's generals. Now, this was a rumor. Now, a lot of people really thought that they actually got married, but it wasn't true. But in any case, the rest of the Diadochi, which Diadochi means successor. So you have the wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors of Alexander the Great, basically what it translates as. So, of course, since people hearing this stuff, the other kings, seeing that Perdiccas would probably marry Cleopatra, they came together against Perdiccas. And, even though it wasn't so, but Cleopatra remained single for a while, of course. And the whole thing was when Alexander died, if you remember the story, you understand his brother, Aridaeus, who was his older half brother, was supposed to take the throne, but he was mentally ill. He was slow. He basically was, mentally unfit to rule the kingdom. And, Alexander understood this. He kept Aridaeus with him and took him out to many battles. He kept him by his side. It was his brother. He actually loved his brother a lot, but he knew he was weak and that he was feeble-minded. He wasn't really there 100%. So Alexander wasn't really worried about him. So now Perdiccas was actually named the regent of the kingdom of Alexander the Great. So since they looked at it and said that, well, this dude is slow, we can't really put him as the ruler. We have to elect a regent, which a regent basically means somebody who's going to basically be ruling in place until the heir becomes of age. Because remember, Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant. And the whole thing was, would she produce a man or a woman? So that was huge. Everybody had to sit back and wait till she had the baby to see if it was going to be a male heir, which would be king eventually, or a girl. So they basically named Aridaeus as ruler. And it was a boy that she had, Alexander IV. They named them two as basically the rulers of the land, basically in name only, like they would be like symbolic rulers, like monarchy, you might as well say. But the power would basically lie with Perdiccas. And he would be the one who basically rules and really has the say-so on what takes place until Alexander IV became of age. So, of course, everybody's looking at Perdiccas as the true ruler. What he says goes. Of course, the other Diadochi, which you have to understand, you really have four main ones, but it's more who would later come into power. So we can't really stick to the main four, one being Ptolemy the First Soter and Perdiccas, of course. There's a lot more who would eventually come into power. And this whole war, this whole Game of Thrones, would take place. So understand again, you have now Perdiccas ruling. And now everybody's looking at Perdiccas, wanting that spot and paying attention to what he's doing and what's going on. The thing is, as I said, Game of Thrones type stuff has happened. You have to understand, you have now Aridaeus, who was the older half brother of Alexander the Great. They are both sons of Philip of Macedonia, who was basically ruling before. Now, what you have to understand is that Philip of Macedonia, his brother was the king, and his brother had a son. Now, of course, when the king dies, the prince rules. The heir is supposed to take over. That's how they was doing it in Greece. But, when Philip's brother died, his son was basically an infant, a baby, a child, so could not rule. So Philip of Macedonia became the regent, just like Perdiccas just became the regent. So you have Philip of Macedonia being the regent now, and the heir waiting for the heir to come of age is what he's supposed to do. And then, turn over the kingdom to him. So basically, Philip of Macedonia was supposed to turn over the kingdom to his nephew, Amyntas. But instead of turning over the kingdom, what he did was declare himself king. Forget being regent. I'm going to declare myself king. And that's what he did. He declared himself king. Amyntas came of age, but Amyntas wasn't really, in a position to challenge the throne, even though he is rightfully his. He didn't really challenge it. He didn't really, care too much about it. He didn't really try to be a threat or a problem to Philip of Macedonia. He just basically conceded. And what Philip did was when he had his daughter, he gave his daughter to his nephew. Remember, that's just how they do in these royal families, their bloodline. So he gave his daughter, Kenene, which a lot of you know who she is. We'll get into that in a second. He gave Kenene to his nephew to basically marry her and basically go about their business. Now, the whole thing was Alexander was born, of course. Now, Alexander is coming up, and Alexander knows that he has basically somebody who can challenge him for the throne once his father dies, and he didn't like that. So he did what any, person would do in that position. He went and he killed her husband, and he basically promised her that he would give her another husband, a powerful husband someday.